So I've been talking a lot lately, and some in posts on Facebook and things like that, about pagan parallels or pagan precursors to things in the gospel or in scripture. The most recent one was about um, Babylonian rituals and how they, well, I didn't spell it out, but how they paralleled the Mass. But the interesting thing was that I got that quotation actually from a paper about how they paralleled rituals that are implied or described in the Psalms, temple rituals from the, well, depending on who you ask, first or second temple period, but it doesn't really matter for present purposes. It's in the temple in Jerusalem. That's the point, that you would have these recitation of divine names, uh, retelling of the stories of the heroic deeds of the god, interspersed with hymns, and then that's followed by the actual ritual, usually a sacrifice. Other things are possible, but that was a general pattern. That's the pattern that you then see repeated in these ritual psalms, and then you see it repeated in the temple, which gets taken up into the Mass, because the Mass historically, fundamentally, is based on the temple ritual. All right. The conversations that have happened around those have mostly focused on people saying, well, of course, there's sort of a common human vocabulary for talking about things. There's a just the Bible simply takes the way people are already talking about things as a convenient place to start. I actually like that. One of my friends commented, Matthew, blanking on your last name. Sorry, Matthew, commented that it's the common vocabulary. I like that, but I think that I think that it's an understatement. It's in the right direction, but it's an understatement. Because it comes back to me to this logos idea, the logos theology of St. John the Apostle, who describes Christ as the creative reason, right? As God's creative reason. He is the divine word which speaks the universe into being. He is the rationale of the natural laws, if that makes sense. Everything that happens naturally and morally, those are patterned on Christ. He is the reason those make sense. Furthermore, he is the mediator between the human mind and the universe. The reason that our rationality corresponds to anything outside of ourselves. The reason that we're not just sort of making incorrect or arbitrary decisions that happen to, or having arbitrary thoughts that happened to help us survive but aren't necessarily true. The reason that that's not the case, the reason that our thoughts are true, that they can actually correspond to external reality, is because we're made in the image of God. We're made in the image of Christ, and he is the rationale of the universe, right? He is that logos. So the reason anything makes sense is because it's patterned on Christ, and the reason it makes sense to us is because we're made in his image. But that means that the meaning of the universe itself, of the created order, is spiritual, right? It's not disconnected from that. Scientific meaning and theological meaning are not radically separate. Now, the methodologies are different, and that's important. And there is a separation of method, but the meanings ultimately are the same. So if you see a pattern in nature, its meaning is theological. I would go even further and say that it's eminently spiritual, but that, well, it matters. So if our pagan ancestors made an accurate observation about the world, that has fundamentally spiritual truth to it. It has theological truth to it. They may misinterpret it. They may interpret it partly correctly and partly incorrectly, but it has theological significance. So, the notion of the dying and rising God, I know this has been done 1,000 times. I know that this is, for those of you who have done sort of religious studies research, bear with me, okay? But the dying and rising God idea comes from this realization that the pagans have, that life for humanity, life for human beings, it comes out of this cycle of death and resurrection. The daily cycle of night and day, the annual cycle of the seasons where the sun seems to be dying and then it comes back, as well as the agricultural cycle, the Dionysian realization that our food, our life itself, comes from the grain falling into the ground and dying, which Christ echoes in the gospel. So those observations, it's not wrong to call them spiritual. It may not be wrong to call them revelatory, but it's natural revelation. It's not necessarily Deus ex machina. It's not necessarily God intervening miraculously into the lives of the pagans. It's God, it might just as well be described as God intervening naturally, or not really intervening. God setting up the cosmic order, setting up the order of creation, such that by merely observing the patterns of the world, the pagans would be prepared for the gospel. They would have an idea that was true, not not merely physically, but spiritually true. And that this comes from the remnant of the divine image, right? It's marred. Tolkien tells us, right? It's though now long estranged, it is not lost nor wholly changed, not wholly lost nor wholly changed. So that rationality, that imagination that comes from the Imago Dei, from the image of God in which we're created, the natural order is reflected back to them through that image of God that's in them, and they perceive natural patterns and through those spiritual truths, which are then fulfilled in the fullness of time in the gospel. And even for the Israelites, before that, they're being, by divine revelation, by more direct revelation, they're being interpreted, but they're not being created out of whole cloth. None of the festivals of the Old Testament are entirely unique to Israel. Go to any agrarian culture in the ancient Near East, and they're going to have something that reminds you, however distantly, but it reminds you of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There's going to be some ritual about the consumption of the new grain, which usually includes abstinence of some kind, such as eating unleavened bread instead of leavened bread, until the harvest is completed. And then there's going to be something like a Day of Atonement and something like a Feast of Sukkot at the end, because it's at the end gathering when all of that is brought in. Now it's given historical significance in the Old Testament. It's given clearer divine interpretation. It's being explained to Israel what this really means, what its implications are theologically. But it's not being created out of whole cloth. It's being adapted from the natural cycle that all of the pagans use as well. So when you see these things, and you think about what the church fathers say, you think about this idea of Praeparatio Evangelica, the preparation for the gospel. don't think of that only, though it includes, but don't think of that only as miraculous divine intervention to help them see and be prepared for the coming of the gospel. You can also see it as built in to creation. It is this natural revelation because of the Logos that leads us all to Christ. Have a nice day. God bless.